Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Fahim Shakur, and welcome to another episode of MEDtalkx on Pendle 103.1 FM. Before we introduce our guests, our topic is on furlough, shielding, and employment rights. Hopefully, it'll be a very interesting evening. Some usual housekeeping things. Our studio number is 01282 723 455. And WhatsApp number is 075 227 Over to you, Mahar.
Thank you, Fahim, and welcome everyone for another show of MEDtalkx. So please do check our YouTube channel as well as our Facebook. So MEDtalkx, that's MEDtalkx with an X. So let's start with our two guests. So ladies first. So we have Dr. Fariah Khan. So she's qualified in medicine from Barts and the London School of Medicine in 2008. She did go on to work in a non-governmental organization looking at improving healthcare in disadvantaged low-income households in Chicago, USA. That's quite interesting. She currently works, she has qualifications as a general practitioner, but also has joined core training in psychiatry. So that's fantastic to hear coming from a psychiatrist perspective. So thank you for coming on the show, Fariah.
Thank you for having me.
And our next guest is Robin Ford. So he qualified in August 2018 from Cardiff and joined Slater and Gordon shortly after. So he's a qualified solicitor covering a range of areas from disciplinary procedures and discrimination to wrongful dismissal and unlawful deduction of wages. So I think you've been there since October 2018, haven't you, Robin?
Yes, that's correct, and thanks for having me.
Fantastic, great stuff. So we'll start the questions with yourself, Fariah. So I understand you had an interesting experience when the whole guidance about shielding came out with coronavirus. That could certainly be valuable to the listeners and viewers.
Yeah, so unfortunately, when I was working, I have asthma, but it's normally fine. But as COVID got worse and worse, I suddenly got really sick. And then I had to see a really sick patient on one of my own calls. And that after seeing him, I just became so sick that I needed to step up my asthma treatment. I needed 3 courses of steroids, 2 courses of antibiotics. And it was really intense for me. And because of that whole experience, I ended up in the high clinical vulnerable group.
Yeah, and how did they communicate that doesn't, that need for you to go into shielding?
Yeah, so unfortunately, this has been an ongoing issue because I wasn't in the high risk group at the beginning and I didn't have a government letter saying I need to shield. It's been through my GP, so I've been given Med3 notes, and my GP's like, if they look at the list, because of what you've been through and your treatment, you are now in the higher risk group. But unfortunately, I've just found it really exhausting. And so I've had to just keep sending in sick notes, or I'm not fit to be face to face.
Right. Robin, I think we can bring you in there. Is this a typical case scenario that you've been dealing with?
Not a huge amount. No, I mean, there are of course going to be people who weren't in the category when we went into lockdown, and then for one reason or another find themselves in it further on. But I think the way Fariah's dealt with it has been exactly right. What I would always advise someone to do is first and foremost speak to your employer. Now, I would hope that if you've got medical evidence to support it, that any reasonable employer will then treat that individual in the same way they would have done with someone who was in that vulnerable category right from the start.
And in terms of furlough and what it is, Robin, can you give the audience and the listeners and the viewers a bit of background? We've used this word, but if I'm honest with you, I think I only came across it during the pandemic. I didn't even hear about the word beforehand. Can you tell us what it means and actually what it is in real life?
Yeah, certainly. And I think there will probably be employment lawyers who hadn't come across it before lockdown started. It wasn't really a term that we used. Essentially, furlough is whereby an employer can keep an employee in their employment but they're no longer performing work. So it's essentially a layoff, and the government brought in the coronavirus job retention scheme to do exactly as the name suggests, and that is to retain those individuals. Now, if they hadn't have done that, lots more people, and there will have been hundreds of thousands already affected by it, would have probably been made redundant. And so what the scheme does is it allows employers who have had a reduction in business as a result of coronavirus to keep those individuals employed. The government will pay their salary, so they'll contribute 80% subject to 2,500. And it keeps those individuals in a job, but it takes away the financial burden of paying the salary from the employer and puts it onto the government.
So what kind of cases have you noticed coming that is perhaps different to the different kind of roles you get, Robin?
Well, of course, us as legal practitioners, we're sort of dealing with it on the fly as much as everyone else is. So, I mean, the scheme's been in place for what, sort of around 4 months or so now. There's not been a huge amount of litigation in respect of coronavirus and furlough and those sorts of matters. The majority of the work I've done personally, being at Slater and Gordon, so we're a firm that we only act for individuals. Okay, we don't act for businesses. Has mainly been people with specific questions on furlough and what their rights are. So I think because there's been lots in the media and there's copious amounts of resource online now, people have been able to go and look and they know how much they're entitled to, but there are always going to be specific questions, and the guidance has been regularly updated and often then picked apart because the situation has been evolving. I think what we are going to see more of, though, is people bringing unfair dismissal claims. Okay, so as the furlough scheme comes to an end, employers will have to make a decision on whether they bring those individuals back properly, as it were, or whether they bring their employment relationship to an end. So we could be looking at lots of redundancies. And I imagine there will be a fair amount of discrimination claims going through as well, because people with disabilities or health conditions that may be disabilities will have been disproportionately affected compared with non-disabled employees.
So, Fariah, I guess in that sense, how have you felt working from home? Have you felt discriminated in terms of doing work, or have you just been recovering at home?
No, unfortunately, I've been working from home during the pandemic, and I've not been discriminated, but because of the nature of my job being a doctor, I can only really do the more paperwork, admin-y jobs, like writing in the notes, doing discharge paperwork, calling patients in, like not really anything which is a bit more my day-to-day. So it's a bit like I'm being a glorified secretary for my team. But obviously, because I want to contribute and I want to help the team, I've been happy to do so. And
for you, how has this impacted on your training? Because at the moment you're going to be starting, hopefully, your second year of core training in psychiatry. Is that correct?
Well, I will in February, because I only started the first in February. So I'm going to got 6 months. So because it has, I mean, for the last 17 weeks, I haven't really been on the wards properly. I haven't done anything like I meant to with my forms and assessments. So I'm going to restart the same placement again. So it has had a huge impact on my training. And if we're worried about a second wave, I'm not sure if I want to work from home or just be off sick or just take some time out.
So in terms of obviously being off, the shielding, I gather, is ending at the end of the month. Is that right for you? And how are you feeling about next week onwards?
Well, because I don't have the letter at the beginning of the month, at the beginning of the pandemic, sorry, my employers have been adamant that I'm not really in the high risk group, even though I am because of the medications I've been taking and the fact that I've had 3 courses of steroids. It kept going back to the fact that, can you bring the government letter? Even though I've explained that I can't, because at the point the letter was given, I wasn't sick, I was okay. So then they've asked me, I've had to go back to work. because unless I have that letter from the government which proves I'm shielding, so then I just didn't want to have a fight. So I've actually been back to work now for 2 weeks.
Robin, kind of bringing you into the conversation here, what should people actually be thinking about, especially when their job circumstances have changed, and a good resource for actual employment rights, and unfair dismissal? What as you said, there needs to be fluid communication with your line manager, but sometimes it can not be very fluid. It can be treacle. So how, what kind of guidance would you give?
Well, this is a really common thing, and we're speaking to lots of people with these sorts of issues at the moment. You're right. Speaking to line managers should always be the first port of call, because lots of these situations can be resolved with that informal chat. Now, situations such as yours, unfortunately, can't be, and so there is more formal action you can take to try to resolve the issue. So you could raise a grievance with your employer. That's your opportunity to raise your complaints formally, and then your employer would have to deal with that in accordance with their grievance policies and procedures. I think the other thing to note from your perspective is that your condition may be a disability for the purposes of the Equality Act, and so if so, you meet that definition, then you'd also have protection from discrimination under that act. And one of the rights you have under the Equality Act is that there is a duty on your employer to make reasonable adjustments. So I do wonder whether there's an argument in that regard. Another thing that individuals can do is you can make a flexible working request. Okay, so there's a statutory procedure for doing so, and it allows you to make a request such as to work from home, and then your employer would have to consider that and deal with it in accordance with the statutory guidance.
To continue that theme, Robin, the whole concept of working from home, I think many people over the course of the pandemic have realized they quite enjoy working from home, whether they need it or not. Is that a good enough reason to continue afterwards, or is that not a good enough reason to ask for flexible working arrangements?
Well, it's going to depend on the employer, the employee, what sort of work they do. Just because they like it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be agreed. Now, I think there will be lots of employers who are all for employees who like working from home doing so, because I think there's often been this idea that if people are allowed to work from home, they'll slack off, or that they won't be doing everything they're supposed to. And many offices and other working environments, there's this presenteeism idea. And I think lots of employers have seen throughout throughout lockdown, that's just not the case. And when you give people the freedom to work how and when they want, they run with it and you get good results. So I would imagine, looking at it practically, there probably will be more people working from home in the future. There are benefits to employers because, of course, the fewer people you have working in the office or wherever the workplace is, the smaller premises you need. So some employers may be able to downgrade, may be able to go over to, say, hot desking type scenarios, and that can save employers money. It could be a good way of bringing in new staff. If you've got a more old-fashioned employer who doesn't want to work in that way post-lockdown, but more modern employers do, then that could be a good way to get people to come over. Now, in terms of a flexible working request, though, the employer doesn't have to agree to it, but they would have to have legitimate business reasons not to do so. So it would be determined on a case-by-case basis, and the employee would need a good reason for it, and then the employer would really that legitimate reason not to agree to it.
So, Fariah, you talked about feeling somewhat like a glorified secretary during the lockdown period, whilst you've been shielding in essence. But at the same time, did it give you a greater opportunity, whether it meant that you could actually learn a lot more, attend a lot more courses, actually give you a different dynamic that perhaps you wouldn't have if you were actually on the shop floor, in essence?
You know, I don't know, my team who are actually on the wards didn't feel like doing this, but I felt a little bit guilty during the time I was home. I felt like, oh, I'm not pulling my weight around, because it wasn't as if when I was out, they found another doctor to do my work. Just the people that were on the ward, the other doctors had to pull in and do what I would normally be doing. So during my time, I did try and, you know, be as helpful as I could. I didn't do any other extra resources because I was still recovering from my asthma exacerbations. And I found it was nice in some ways. I wasn't around chaos. Like being on an acute psychiatry ward can be really chaotic at times. And I was able to peacefully do some of the work. But at the same time, I was overwhelmed with guilt that I should just be there with my colleagues.
And how much contact did you have and continue to have with your peers during this period?
So I saw my team every morning in Microsoft Teams and like something like that. So every day in the morning I'd see, and they're like, oh, there's so much to do. Oh, we've only got 2 of us here today. You know, and I know they didn't mean it because they weren't saying it to me in like an attacking way. It was just like a general conversation. But I felt guilty, and I thought, oh, I should just be with them, you know. And so I saw them every day. I'm attending ward rounds where someone's speaking, and I'm documenting every day. So I'm still very much in the ward, except I'm a bit removed, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, because we did have what we call huddles first thing in the morning, and then cuddles at the end of the day, which is an interesting way of doing it. But certainly, I think towards the end of the day, it gave everyone the opportunity to talk about anything non-work related, to be honest. You could hear it initially at the beginning, but as people got on with work, people just crack on because they know that they've got those informal channels anyway. But no, that's great to know. Thank you for it.
Yeah, so Robin, in terms of obviously the things that Fariah has been saying and how she's felt guilty, I know a lot of people have felt guilty and therefore they may not have gone down the grievance route or other things. I mean, what are the other channels available to them if they don't want to do that? Because that doesn't always go down well, does it? Taking a grievance against your employer, is that always helpful?
No, not necessarily. I mean, any employee has the right to do so, but and whilst the intention of the grievance procedure should be to raise the complaints, the employer to look into them and try to find a solution, it can be antagonistic in some circumstances, even if that's not the intention to do so. And my advice is always, as a first port of call, speak to your line manager informally. Okay, I think often there can be this tendency for employees to think, my employer's not treating me properly, and you build up this big bad image of the employer. But of course, the employer is the company that you work for. In terms of who you actually deal with, it's still people at the end of the day. And so my advice is always going to be, pull someone to one side, tell them what the issues are, tell them what you need them to do, and see if you can resolve it that way. Now, if not, I completely understand the concern with the grievance procedure. I think lots of people have that sort of feeling of guilt or not wanting to make any trouble or make things difficult for people. But sometimes it needs to be done because we all have employment rights. And if your employer is not treating you as they should do, then you should raise it with them. I mean, other options than a grievance are probably going to be seen by most people to be more serious. So I mentioned the Equality Act earlier. While still employed, you can bring a discrimination claim against your employer. But I would have thought most people, if you're averse to raising the grievance, that's going to seem like an even more serious measure to take. But like I said, my advice is always try to deal with it informally. And if not, there are options out there that you can use. And take legal advice. There's no reason why you can't speak to a lawyer and tell them what the issues are and see if they can work with you to find a way to resolve it. Sometimes a letter from a lawyer might be enough to just prompt your employer to think, actually, maybe we need to do X, Y, and Z.
That's some good tips there, Robin. And what about, I guess, the elephant in the room, people who've either died or contracted COVID through their line of work? What is the advice for them? What can they do? Can they get money? Can they get compensation?
Well, not my area. I imagine it would fall under sort of personal injury law. So it's not something I would deal with personally, but I'd certainly say take legal advice, because employers have a duty of care to their employees. And that's why lots of employers have been having people work from home if they're able to do so. But if not, if you say got factories or supermarkets or those types of workplaces where you can't work from home, you need people in there, employers should have been putting all the appropriate safety measures in place. And I mean, we've all seen tons in the news, haven't we, about PPE? I'm sure you've had your own dealings with it yourselves. But there are things that employers should have done. And if they failed to do so and someone suffered harm or even died, then there could be equal claims there, and there could be a remedy against the employer.
And Fariah, when the shielding restrictions relax, what are your thoughts on how comfortable you are going back to work? What kind of return to work procedures have your employer supported you with?
Well, none actually. So it's been a bit of a haphazard, because I think obviously this is a new situation. We've never had a pandemic before. So I've been asked to first speak to the occupational health, who then said, go speak to your GP. Sometimes it depends which GP I get in the surgery. Some are like, oh, I can't even talk to you about this. This is all for your occupational health to discuss. And I'm like, but they've told me to speak to you. And, and I think because I am a doctor, I can just say, hold on a second, guys. I think we're just going round and round in circles. But if I wasn't, I would just be going from pillar to post. One says, oh, this is out of our remit. You need X. Go see your GP. The GP is like, oh, I can't do that letter. I can't do this. And then it falls back to you just didn't have the government letter to begin with. And so initially, one GP I spoke to said you should be slowly eased back into the job. My line manager, one of my consultants, said, no, actually, you're well now. What's the point? The occupational health was like, well, do what you think best. And sometimes it's so frustrating because no one really is taking any ownership and no one really knows what they're doing. And so it's a bit of trial and error. So I just ended up going back to work full time as normal. And then I speak to my GP after a couple of weeks, and my peak flow has gone down, but it's not significant, and I still feel okay. So I'm just carrying on.
Yeah, and you say this kind of lack of ownership, I guess. Do you think it's because the situation is unclear, or do you feel that because as a trainee, you've got also your educational program, you've got the training program director, as well as the education supervisor. So there's lots of people there that can potentially guide the situation, but that maybe some trainees listening in or viewing this may be in a similar position. So I don't know what kind of advice you'd give.
So I actually had a meeting with the training director, my educational supervisor, one of the deans of the School of Psychiatry, and this was on the basis of what to do if there's a second wave. And so at the end of the meeting, we defined that there is a problem. I have, serious asthma. I don't want to be sick again. But we really didn't say what the solution was. It's more like, and I get really frustrated with this, it's more like reactive. So if I get sick, then we'll do something, as opposed to proactive. Why do I need to get sick before something happens? And I find that sometimes really disheartening and very frustrating, that we need to see, something happening before we jump in to, rescue me.
Yeah, a lot of sobering thoughts there. Robin, we've had some questions come through, so I want to ask you if you're happy to take this one. The question is, could religious institutions, i.e. mosques, be sued if someone catches COVID whilst attending the mosque?
Well, again, not my area of law, I'm afraid. I mean, it would be a personal injury matter, but any time you've got members of the public coming into your premises, whatever kind of organisation, business you are, then there's going to be a responsibility to ensure that those people are properly protected, in the same way that we could all be responsible on our own personal property if someone were to suffer harm. So, I mean, what I would say is, if you're concerned with something like that, follow the government guidance, and that's always going to be the first place to start as we continue to sort of navigate our way through COVID. But if people are concerned that they've suffered some sort of health issue or injury as a result of, say, being in a mosque or wherever it may be, then take some advice from a personal injury lawyer, would be my view.
Okay. And in terms of, obviously, employment rights, you talked a bit about employment rights. What about if you can just talk a little bit about changing your hours? That seems to be a big one. So a lot of people have now thought they may wish to change their hours because they found that it suits them better with their lifestyle now. Is that a reasonable request in terms of what you said that the employer should listen to, or not?
Yes, certainly, because it could benefit employers. I think what the lockdown has really shown, particularly from people who've been working from home, is that lots of people have different schedules. And so people with childcare responsibilities often need to be available to do the school run. So I think if we're being realistic, probably the traditional 9 to 5 for office workers is going to be a thing of the past. And I mean, my personal view is it should be. We don't work to the same timescales as we used to. Now, if people do want to change their hours, speak to your employer. There's also the flexible working request, and there are other ways it can be done. So, especially with the furlough scheme at the moment, some people are working part-time on that, and then they'll be furloughed for the hours that they're not working. I think, practically speaking, the way to do it is, I think, look at what your schedule is. Okay, and if you still can work your normal hours, as it were, and you want to, well, then that's fine. But if there are things that you think, well, actually, on a Wednesday, I need to pick up my child from school, speak to your employer first of all, because you may be able to agree just in that sort of chat. If not, then you've got the flexible working request, which is the formal way of requesting it. And I mentioned it earlier, I think employers will have to become more accommodating to this sort of thing, because otherwise they're going to run the risk of staff going elsewhere, because progressive employers will allow this sort of flexibility. Lots of places offer flexi time now, don't they? Whereas go back to the 20, 30 years and it was probably unheard of. So I think it's definitely changing, and I would imagine that COVID and the effects of it have probably pushed that on further than we would have been had it not all happened.
Right, just a question for yourself. How would you support trainees that maybe feel isolated during this period, who may be shielding for health reasons, and what can they do about it?
I mean, obviously, it's so isolating anyway. You're all by yourself, or you're with your family, but you're still alone. And I think the best thing to do would be like join WhatsApp groups with other trainees and make contact with your team. Try and use things like Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So at least you're still talking to people. And if you don't want to talk to your work colleagues or your peer group, then at least talk to just your friends. Like I've been to quite a few, virtual quizzes organized by some of my friends. I mean, I'm awful at quizzes, but I've still attended just because it's a bit more social. So I can at least see people, as opposed, if you can't really see them, at least you can see them through a camera lens.
Yeah, and clearly people would, I think it's something that we also have to be mindful that we're supporting people with mental health difficulties as well. In terms of our day job, and isolation can be felt very quickly, can't it? Especially when services change with the way how they interact. I understand you're working in an acute unit, but certainly community as well as redeployment has been an issue. I don't know how that's been for you or your colleagues.
So yeah, we've had a few of the Foundation Year 2 trainees and Foundation Year 1 trainees being moved from the community mental health team or the psychiatric liaison team to go into the main hospital, whether that be in the medical physician team or in A&E. So we've suddenly felt, at the start of the pandemic, we've lost quite a lot of our doctors. And then people's job roles has changed. So a lot of the trainees have had to be really flexible. We've had wards that have been closed down, new wards created elsewhere. One of my colleagues on my ward, she came from another hospital completely, but her ward closed down and she was redeployed here. So I think a lot of them have suddenly felt completely, in a foreign place, a bit fish out of water. But then because everyone's been feeling it together, it's not just one person, we've all had to come together and show some kind of solidarity and, be a bit more camaraderie spirit type thing, as opposed to saying, you're not doing this correctly, don't you know where that is? Everyone's trying to be nicer to each other. But I agree, the patients have also felt it, because where they can maybe see a doctor very quickly, suddenly now there's a lot more waiting time. Sometimes they couldn't come into the hospital. So it's been really a big adjustment for them as well.
Okay. Fariah, I just want to continue the theme. Just looking at your background in your bio, I know you did a master's in public health. You're probably thinking you know where this is going, and also you try to help disadvantaged low-income households in Chicago. We now have a huge public health campaign that's been going on over the last few months, and I think it would be remiss of me not to just ask for your opinion regarding the public health way that this has been handled, and any thoughts of looking at disadvantaged households in Chicago. Can you extrapolate from that to the UK households?
I think, first of all, I think a lot of the way our public health has been handled has been really dire, and it's a bit embarrassing. We've got the highest death rate in Europe, or one of the highest, which is really embarrassing if we think that we've got universal healthcare, we've got a great benefit system. Why are we having so many deaths? And I think clearly some of the messages of, shielding, washing hands, social isolation, this is from March onwards, haven't clearly been filtering through the most vulnerable people or those that need it. The farce of the lack of PPE for the medical staffing. Then you've got not sure who's being tested, who should isolate, who shouldn't. And I just think we've had so many mixed messages that I myself am now confused. Are we back to normal? Are we not? And then suddenly now we've got, let's wear a mask. But, 2 months ago, masks were not useful at all. And I think that's been really unhelpful. We've never had a clear, decisive line from the public health team that says this is all the stuff we should be doing. And I think we've kind of stopped following what the WHO have said. We've done our own path.
Okay. And just to take that further, just on a tangential, but also important over this week, we've talked a little bit about obesity in the news, and we're getting perhaps mixed messages. What do you think? On the one hand, try and go out and eat on Monday to Wednesdays in August, but eating out puts on a lot of calories, isn't good for your health. But at the same time, get a bike and let's sort out your bike so you can do. What do you think of this public health message on obesity via government, economy, and also health?
I think, again, it's a bit of a joke. Yeah, because on one hand, you're encouraged, you're going to get £10 off if you eat out. On the other hand, you'll get a bike. Then we know that those that are higher risk factors who are obese, if you're obese, you are at higher risk of dying from having COVID. So we're giving everyone all the messages. And unfortunately, I think a part of the problem is we give a lot of freedom to the individual. Do what you think best. Here are all the different scenarios. But we don't really say it in the way that we explain. Actually, if you are obese, do not eat out. You're going to put on more calories. You're going to put on weight. Instead, cook and stay in and maybe ride the free bike that you're entitled to. We're saying do whatever you think and good luck.
Robin, I'm going to try and bring you here because I am mindful there are 3 public sector doctors in this conversation, so it can focus very easily on those kind of areas. But bringing the public and the private sector into it, are the rights different for people that work in both those areas?
No, not massively so. I mean, the public sector, there is a duty under the Equality Act to promote, equality and diversity. But in terms of the fundamental rights, they're going to be broadly the same, whether you work in public sector and private sector. Now, what my colleagues and I tend to find is that often public sector employers will deal with things in a different way, shall we say, to private companies, which is obviously going to be motivated by money. At the end of the day, you'll find that private employers will often take commercial decisions, and they will weigh up risk based on cost to the company. Whereas in the public sector, that's not going to be the focus.
Yeah, and one thing that I am mindful of is just about, you mentioned the issue of redundancies earlier. So Primark, being quite a big organisation, rejected the £30 million kind of bonus or assistance package from the government, just in terms of job retention. So for every furloughed worker, they'd get £1,000. So they said, actually, no, we should, in essence, we're okay. Maybe more recently, their stance may have changed, but that's what I read from Sky News. So do you see that companies, and I think Primark did pretty well during the lockdown period. So are they refocusing on their kind of business model, and is this an opportunity for them to be a lot more streamlined?
Yes, I would have thought so. I mean, it has forced lots of organisations of whatever size to look at their business model and look at how staffing structure is and how many staff they've got and what positions they're in. And they're, of course, going to try to cut cost wherever they possibly can. And if, as a result of COVID, they've had to, furlough people or make them redundant, and then the employer realizes, well, actually, that department that had 50 people in, we've managed to cope with only 30. Well, then moving forward, why keep 50? So I think it is going to prompt changes.
So how do you tease out the unfair dismissal, or is that a fair dismissal?
Well, the Employment Rights Act gives employees who've been employed for 2 years or more the right not to be unfairly dismissed. So until you get to that 2-year period, you don't have the right. But once you do, the employer can only dismiss you if they have a fair reason. Redundancy is going to be one of those fair reasons. Okay, so there are 5 under the Act. But it has to be a genuine redundancy exercise. So if you've got an employer who's, say, taken dislike to a person, they want to get rid of them, and they say it's a redundancy, but it's not, it's a sham, well, then that would potentially be an unfair dismissal. The other thing for employers to consider as well is, even if there is a genuine need to make redundancies, they still have to do everything procedurally properly. Otherwise, again, they'd open themselves up to the risk of an unfair dismissal claim. So that's going to be things like consulting with the employees at risk, looking at alternatives to redundancy, looking at alternative roles for them, trying to find ways to avoid making people redundant, because really that should be a last resort.
Okay. Fariah, there's a possibility of a second wave people talk about, and preparation in terms of maybe shielding again. How do you feel about these thoughts? Do you think about them, or they're not on your mind, or how do you feel?
No, I do. I'm really worried because I don't want to get sick again, and then I don't want to let my team down again. And and it's really difficult for me. And I think maybe if I was doing a different job, I wouldn't feel that bothered about just shielding. But because I know that I'm a doctor, I'm trying to help people, I don't want to be a burden on the team. So I do. It really plays on my mind. And I think at the moment, because the prevalence is so low, it's great. I don't have to worry about it. But I always think, flu season, when this, in the winter, autumn time, will this come back and will it be worse? And how will it affect me? And then how will it affect the team around me as well? Because I don't want to leave them hanging, without a doctor. So yeah, it does play on my mind a lot.
And I know from your biography, again, I have been really looking at your biography, haven't I?
Yes.
You also work for another organization that believes in drug-free biomedical therapies. Have you been is that like a holistic therapies, or is that anything that the audience can maybe take away from that and from a holistic drug-free way of living?
Well, if they can look up the Key Clinic. It's a private clinic based in Berkshire, near Oxford, and it does lots of different exercises and stuff, and it's mainly to help like children or adults who've got autism or other mental health disorders. And then also it's about your diet and your lifestyle and what supplements you can have. And I think there's lots out there, so if people want to improve their immunity, then especially with COVID, maybe get some vitamin D in them, get some vitamin C. So it's really very natural. And you can do that by, getting some sunshine because the weather's great, or by the foods that you're eating, like, have more fruits, vegetables, sort of stuff like that. But I want to say that there aren't any quick fixes. It's not like a magic wand. You have to put in effort. You need, slow lifestyle changes, little by little. It's not going to be one day you have 4 oranges and then you're fine for like a month. Slow and steady every day. But yeah, everyone should check it out. It's the Key Clinic.co.uk.
So I think, if people certainly just make sure for the listeners and viewers, if they have any issues, do always consult with that first protocol, the general practitioner, and then look at what's available. Obviously, Key Clinics further down south, but there's lots of great public sector as well as the voluntary sector and private sector services available. So just always keep that in mind. We do have a question for yourself, Robin. You may have touched on it, but clearly I think the listener may want a bit more detail. Can employees be forced back into their offices, and what grounds can they justify to work from home?
Well, they can't be forced in. We've of course got a choice with whether we do or not. I think what the employment contract will say for most individuals is that they have a place of work. And so from the question, I'm assuming we're looking at an office type working environment. Now, if that's the place of work and that's what the contract says, well, then the employer can ask the employee to come back in. Now, that employee could challenge that and they could ask to continue working from home. Employer doesn't necessarily need to agree to it, but I think we need to look at why the employer wants them to come back in and why the employee does not want to go. If they're a legitimate health ground, so say a disability, then that could be a reasonable adjustment to continue working from home. My advice to anyone who finds themselves in that situation is going to be similar to what I said earlier, really, and that is speak to your employer first and foremost. Try to get more information, try to find out what their plan is, why they need you to do it, what measures they're going to put in place. Because I would imagine that the return to the office is going to look very different to how it did back in February and March. I don't think there are going to be rows and rows of people with desks close to each other. I would hope that desks are well spaced, and you'll probably have employees on a rota, and you may have a week on, week off, that sort of thing, as opposed to, right, COVID's gone, everyone back in and carry on as normal. So speak to the employer. Again, you've got that grievance option if you need to. And there may be legal claims if your employer is being unreasonable or in any way discriminatory.
Yeah.
Okay, Robin, since we scheduled this session a few weeks ago, so many things have happened that are topical. One is today, as I was listening to the radio on the way to work, a famous pasty maker company, which I won't name. The boss said that he won't pay for employees if they're stuck on quarantine, and that they shouldn't expect the company to pay. Is this something we're going to be seeing more of with the change? Obviously, what happened with coming back from Spain, is this lawful, and is this right? And what do you think of what employers should be paying if you're on quarantine, if you go on holiday? Because I thought we were allowed to go on summer holidays, or that was a bit of a mantra coming out a few weeks ago.
Well, it was, wasn't it? It was to get away, to go to other places, enjoy life, and all the rest of it. I mean, it was Dominic Raab earlier this week had gone on to, I'm not sure where he was, but had said that individuals with less than 2 years service were protected by law. It puts those people in a really difficult position, actually, because once you've got that 2 years service, you have that right not to be unfairly dismissed. And so what it means is that your employer needs to treat you fairly. If you find yourself stuck in that quarantine position and then you're dismissed as a result of it, you may have an unfair dismissal claim. If your employer does something that you consider to be unfair, then you may have a constructive dismissal claim. Now, I wouldn't tell anyone to resign and look to bring that claim without taking legal advice first. But it's potentially going to leave those people in a really difficult position, because there will be people who have booked holidays prior to this coming into place, not expecting anything to change, and it may be non-refundable. And then what do? Do you, when you've been cooped up for however many months, do you tell your family that you now can't go away? Or do you do it and then run the risk that it might affect your employment? So it puts people in a really difficult position.
Okay. And obviously, to carry that theme, you mentioned about these 2 years, and I think it was 1 year in the past, and it got changed a few years ago. Can you tell just the audience the difference between, say, your probation period, which is often maybe 3 months, and this golden 2 years? What's the difference in terms of what can happen to you via your employer?
Okay, so probation periods are commonplace now in virtually all new jobs, and it's usually going to be around the 3 month mark, I would have thought. The purpose of the probation period is really to see whether that employee is any good or not, whether you want to keep them on long term. And so the main point is likely going to be notice. Okay, so in that 3 month period, let's say it is, the employer will probably be able to dismiss the employee and only give them a week's notice, is usually commonplace. So it doesn't have to be a week, but the reason I say a week is that after a month of employment, you have a legal right to a week's notice. Okay, and that week runs up until 2 years service. So it gives the employer an easy way to get out of it. Usually after the probation period, the contractual terms will change slightly, and things like notice. So if you've got an employee in a more senior position, they might have a notice period of 3 to 6 months. But of course, you don't want that notice period to be in place right from the start, because if you bring them in and they can't do the job, then you've got to wait 3 to 6 months to be able to get rid of them. Now, in terms of the 2 year point, as you say, that's where you have to get to qualify for that unfair dismissal, right? It did used to be a year. I think it changed in 2012, I believe. And there was talk in the last election of Labour introducing those rights from day one. So whether it'll change in the future or not is another thing. But I speak to quite a lot of people, and I have done in recent months actually, who don't necessarily realise that you have to get to that 2 years. And I think most people will think, well, of course my employer has to have a fair reason, a proper reason to dismiss me. They can't just get rid of me because they want to, but there will be lots of people who will have been affected by that recently.
That's quite a good detailed response there, Robin. Thank you for that. It's just, I guess, speaking, kind of staying on point with the topical thing, there are people who have booked holidays. They may have booked holidays before COVID-19 to go to Spain, for example. And because for whatever reason they weren't able to get refunds or claim back through insurance, they've proceeded to take that holiday. It may fall under the non-essential travel. So I don't know what kind of position those individuals are, because when they return, I'm assuming they'll probably go into quarantine. So in terms of pay and those kind of things, is a bit of a clouded topic. So I don't know what kind of rights that they have.
Well, it will depend on length of service. Okay, so again, you'll have that protection from unfair dismissal. I think I would encourage anyone in that position to talk to their employer beforehand, because you can establish how the employer is going to deal with it before you go away. I think it would be somewhat short-sighted on an individual's part to not talk to their employer, just go on the holiday because it's been booked, and then see what happens when they get back. There are other options, though. You could look to take more annual leave. You could speak to your employer about whether you can take it as unpaid leave. You could see whether you can work from home. So it's not necessarily going to be you're either in work or you're not. I would just encourage people to speak to their employers beforehand to try to establish what the position is going to be when they get back, if they do decide to go.
Yeah, I think.
Fariah, we're coming near the end of the show, so there's just something that I want to touch upon. Obviously, you're a BAME employee, Black and ethnic minority, and that's been a lot in the news regarding everything going on in terms of just risk of COVID and so on. Have you got any thoughts on that issue yourself?
Yeah, I think it is, again, I think, and I've been very vocal, and I haven't been very complimentary of our Department of Health and our government's approach to COVID. And also, I think this is like a big travesty. It's a shock. Why is it that there's been such a disproportionate amount of deaths and illness coming from the BAME community? I think this is something that we really need to look at, because clearly, when we think of the UK, we think it's such a great equal society. But if there's such a disproportionate amount of death from one community, clearly something isn't that equal. There is something going on. And I think the reasons for that is probably very complex and, multifaceted. But I think, at least we're now putting the spotlight on it. And, we can't just hide away from the fact that we're so great, everything's so wonderful in the UK. Because if it was, then you wouldn't see such a disproportionate amount of deaths.
Yeah, strong views, definitely. Yeah, I mean, Robin, we normally ask all our guests like top 3 tips that they want to give the audience in terms of what they should be doing. Obviously, yours to do with employment law. I'm going to ask a cheeky question now. Is now a good time to ask people for pay rises, or your employers, if you've been working very hard, say, over the last 3-4 months? It's never a good time, is it? Culturally, I think as British, we're not always very open in asking for a pay rise or actually extolling our virtues to our employer. So if you could maybe say when's the best time to ask for a pay rise or negotiate that, and just about maybe some top 3 tips, obviously, for the audience in terms of making sure they can preserve their employment rights.
Yeah, sure. That's a really good point. I think employers often breed this culture of not talking about salary because they don't want people to do so, because then that's going to lead people to say, well, hang on a minute, they get paid more than me and I've been here longer, or whatever it may be. People should always be looking at this. There is data that shows that men are on average paid more than women. There's been lots about equal pay over the past few years. I don't think there's ever a good time, because of course employers don't want to pay people any more than they have to. I think at the moment it's quite a tricky time, really, because of course lots of employers have been really badly affected by COVID. Lots of businesses have taken a hit. So from an employer's perspective, probably less likely and less able to give out pay rises. But the flip side of that is that the people who have been working have had to work harder, because as there have been people furloughed and people on sick leave and away for whatever reason, there will be those employees who've had to pick up the slack. So it's a difficult one, but I wouldn't say to anyone, don't ask about pay now necessarily. If you think you're being underpaid, then speak to your employer about it, because if you're doing good work, you should be paid the appropriate amount for it. In terms of my top 3 tips, I think first and foremost, particularly now, health has to be the priority. Okay, and that's the same from an employment perspective. So if you've got underlying health conditions that mean you need to shield or work from home, that should be the focus. So that would be one. In terms of number 2, I've said it quite a few times this evening, speak to your employer. Okay, open that dialogue. Most employers are reasonable and they will listen to their employees, and if there are ways they can help, they will do so. So I would always suggest that be the first port of call. If not, people do have legal rights. And so thirdly, I would say speak to a lawyer. Okay, there will be lots of solicitors who you'll be able to grab for 10, 15 minutes. So try and speak to someone and get help. Lots of people may not be able to afford legal help, but then there are other resources. So gov.uk has lots of good info, Citizens Advice Bureau, and then depending on where you are in the UK, there may be sort of local services or charities, or some lawyers will do work pro bono. So there is a lot out there, and don't be afraid to ask for help.
Oh, that's great. And what about yourself, Fariah? Any kind of summarizing thoughts on this, as well as 3 tips?
I think definitely, if like Robin said, I'm going to echo, your health comes first. So definitely my first tip is don't feel guilty if you have to shield and you can't work as you normally would. I think there's no point going in and being a martyr and then getting sicker or, dying. You're better off actually working from home or taking time out. And the other thing is, I know it's really confusing, but try and follow some of the guidance. So, take the 2 meters or 1 meter social distancing and wear a mask and wash hands. So that's about 4 tips. But those sorts of things I think are really important.
Yeah. So I think we're running out of time, aren't we, Fahim? It's an hour has flown by.
I know, no break. And big thanks to both of you, Robin and Fariah, for giving up your Tuesday night and spending it with Mehran and I. I guess what's left is Mehran to introduce what's happening next week.
Yeah, so next week we're hopefully going to have Dr. Khurram Sadiq. So he's a consultant psychiatrist, but he's also going to be talking about social media and mental health. So this is an interesting topic, especially because I guess by default screen time has increased during this lockdown period. But if you want to know a bit more about him, do check out his YouTube video. It's called From Homo Sapiens to Formo Sapiens, the Ordeal of Screen Time Addiction.
Great. Thank you, everyone. And we wish you all a good evening and see you again next Tuesday, 8 to 9 p.m. And a big thanks once again to Robin and Fariah for spending your time and sharing your insight and wisdom with us this evening. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.